Welcome, Ecom Logistics Nation. Thank you for joining today's episode. We're on a mission to share e-commerce logistics insights, trends, successes, and challenges from the leaders and innovators in our space.
Returns fraud and returns abuse is like a $100 billion problem in the US. And when you think about that, that's 3 times the size of the problem that it was a few years ago. And I think what ends up being true is anytime you continue to make something easier and you automate it, you're creating new fraud vectors.
Welcome, Ecom Logistics Nation. We have a very special episode for you today, which includes some of the most innovative leadership in the reverse logistics space. Joining our panel discussion is Gayle Tait, CEO at Trove, Jonathan Poma, co-founder and CEO at Loop, Amina Ali, CEO at Optoro, Kyle Burton, co-founder and CEO at 2Boxes, and last but not least, Julian Mitchell, co-founder and CIO at G2 Reverse Logistics. I want to thank you guys for joining us today. And to get the conversation started, would love for each of you to take a couple minutes introducing yourself, your company, and the solution you provide. Amina, would you mind kicking things off for us?
Absolutely, Dan and everyone else. Pleasure to be with you here today. Love this podcast. So Optoro is in the returns and reverse logistics space. We've been at it for quite some time, for about 15 years. And really, here's our lens on the problem. We take a look at 3 components of addressing the issue, the challenges of returns and reverse logistics. It's the initiation, it's the returns method to actually get product back, and then what happens when the product meets the warehouse. So then it's all about processing and smart dispositioning and circularity. So we're taking a look at an end-to-end life cycle view of returns, and we work with enterprise brands, 3PLs. Really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Gayle, would you go next, please?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me. So I'm Gayle Tait. I'm the CEO of Trove. Trove is a resale platform for brands. So what we do is we work with brands and retailers to power their trade-in and resale programs. So all the way through to a customer can bring an item back to a store. We have software in 900 stores across the US. The items then come back into either our facility or a brand's facility, and it's processed through a pretty rigorous reverse logistics process where we're really capturing data on that item to enable the highest value ROI of that item and then reselling it on a website powered by Trove's technology. So very excited to be here and talk about this extremely interesting and intricate space.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Jonathan Poma, co-founder and chief executive at Loop. Loop is a returns management solution specifically focused on serving merchants using the Shopify platform. We handle returns initiation. We serve about 4,000 merchants, doing about 15% of the GMV on Shopify. A few million returns a month are being initiated through Loop and obviously integrated with a bunch of the third-party logistics providers. And then routing is where we get into the reverse logistics world and making sure we send the products that are initiated back to the right locations, right destinations, whether that's fulfillment, circularity, et cetera.
Excellent. Thank you. Kyle?
I'm Kyle Bertine. I'm the co-founder and CEO of 2Boxes. 2Boxes is a couple years old at this point, and we focus really specifically on return processing in warehouses across North America today, but we'll be launching in the UK and the EU next year. And really what we focus on is being more or less an agnostic piece of technology that can process any return from any brand, regardless of the channel of how it was routed in that warehouse. And we really focus on driving that efficiency, intelligence, and sustainability in the warehouse operations. Right now, we're working across about 25 warehouses in North America, processing well over 100 million of returns GMV on an annual basis. Excited to be here, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Julian?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan and Anand, for having me. Julian Mitchell. I am the co-founder and CIO of G2 Reverse Logistics. G2, while we've been in organization for about 4 years, actually has our roots built with Genco, a former 3PL. We are focused vertically stacked in the returns ecosystem. We're everything from returns initiation, how you start, all the way through returns routing, return method, and within the warehouse in processing and their final dispositioning. We also offer our customers an ability to re-commerce the product. And finally is our analytics as a service solution, where we're offering analytics smart table. So really excited to be here. Look forward to a great conversation today. Thanks.
Appreciate that, Julian. Well, listen, we've been to quite a few conferences so far this year, and one thing is for certain, returns is top of mind for everyone that we're talking with, and a lot of the talk tracks are centered around returns and solving for it. And I think it was reported that the cost of returns in the U.S. was close to $800 billion in 2022, with 3/4 of that coming from retail, the rest from online. So certainly explains why that hyper focus is there and the attention that all of your solutions are getting. So would love to get from each of you your view on the state of the industry, so to speak, the state of the union as it relates to returns and the reverse logistics space. And Gayle, would love if you could start for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think we come at it from a slightly different angle. I mean, we talk to a lot of big brands in the space who are really trying to recapture revenue from items that have come back through a returns process, but that are not able to be resold as first quality. And I think what's really interesting there is that re-commerce provides a slightly different angle in that by reselling those items at a lower price point, you're able to capture new customers to the brand. I guess we're really coming at it from a revenue driving angle as opposed to like a cost reduction or revenue recuperation. I think what's very interesting is the partners that we talk to are kind of overwhelmed. There's lots of different challenges in different parts of the funnel of the returns process. And I think everyone is just trying to figure it out, but there's definitely an appetite to start to think about the problem more comprehensively than just how do I get my customers' return back and get them the refund, to how do I really start to capture those items, understand if I can't resell them as new, if they can't go back to stock, and then what is the solution that's going to best enable me to capture that upstream revenue from the items that are not perfect. So I think a very complex space, a much bigger appetite than I think we've seen in previous years to really start to address this problem. I think it feels like right now returns is becoming much more of a pressing issue, and it's exciting. It's definitely exciting to see the momentum in the market.
Yeah, completely agree. And someone who's been in a lot of different warehouses too, returns processing and all of that is usually like in the back of the corner that's not well lit and dim and, not a lot of focus. And you see that changing. And Anad, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to also the term re-commerce in itself, right? Like there is just the delineation or the distinction between resale re-commerce and liquidation on the other side, right? Like it is wildly different, right? Like where there is a brand control from a resale re-commerce to identify what's important to control your brand and brand's messaging and keep it within your ecosystem, or more about the net recovery, right? Like maybe brand is not as important and you would kind of put it out there. So we use the word re-commerce, which is how we describe it, but there is two different aspects of it, and they also operate in different universes, right, within the resale re-commerce versus the liquidation space, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think when a brand is reselling on their own website, there is a different expectation both from the brands that we work with, right? A very high quality experience. They want to ensure that their customers get really good items and that there's a real surprise and delight customer experience. So when an item is purchased, that customer really has insight as to what is wrong with this item. On re-commerce programs that Trove is powering, which we power about 65% of all of the traffic going to branded resale programs comes through a Trove powered website. What we see is that we're actually getting different sources of product, right? Returns is about half of the product, but we also are powering a trade-in program as well. And so that's a very specific type of logistics challenge that we're also facing. But again, really with a focus on rewarding loyal customers, bringing new customers to the brand, as well as kind of reducing Scope 3 emissions overall. And so just a very big segment of this space.
Yeah, and this is, I think, and thank you very much, Gayle, for that, because I think that's what we are going to realize as we go through the panel about this discussion is the number of ways a customer has to, or a merchant has to think about from a return standpoint and their return strategy. Is it A, B, C, or is it actually going to be a multitude? And there are certain types of vendors where, that is something that's required, or merchants that's where something like that, a complete controlled brand experience. But then you are going to find where it's like, oh, for product A, I'll do this, but for product B, I might do that. But product C, there is a sustainability question. In product D, I have legal contractual commitments on return to vendor, and I just have to do that, right? So the complexity really, I think it's going to show the nuances as we go through. So thank you very much for that, Gayle.
Yeah. Amina, from your view?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Just to add, I think it's absolutely critical that from a dispositioning standpoint, these systems need to, include and support thousands of different rules. So I think on the one hand, we can get discouraged by thinking about how much returns are going up and what a thorny problem they are. But then when you take a look at what we can do from a technology and systems perspective, partially by partnering among some of our companies, I get really excited and heartened by the impact we can have on the customer experience, on circularity, and on the financial experience. And that's what keeps me going.
And so much to unpack over there, what you just said, Amina, right? The amount of environments that I walked through, and lately, at least 3 of the companies that are represented are running in parallel inside these environments, right? As much as there is competition, there is also the partnership ecosystem which has evolved. That as much as there is competition, there is also the partnership ecosystem which has evolved. That one company can't solve it all and try and bring it together. And I'm talking about some really large apparel retailers where I've seen, 3 of these companies actually present at the same time, running in the same facility from a warehouse execution and RTV. And just for some listeners where the term might be new, I just want to expand upon its return to vendor. And that return to vendor concept goes so deep that for Best Buy, and I'm just going to make an assumption because I don't know the details, I can say this. Just one vendor, let's say Samsung, there could be a possibility that there is a different return to vendor contractual need for Samsung TVs versus washing machines. At what point do you return? And how do you return? And when do you cut what's called a return authorization? It starts getting into some real complexity. So I think there is that magnitude of this industry, right? To most consumers, it just goes back. But what happens after is what you all solve. So again, thank you very much, Amina.
Absolutely. Kyle, your thoughts?
Sure. I think what's really impressed upon me, given that we're a relatively young company, is just how much has changed, honestly, in the last 3 years. There's been a huge increase in interest in this space from merchants in particular. And I think a lot of that has to do with just macroeconomic changes over the last, couple of years. Frankly speaking, I've had many experiences back in 2021, 2022, talking with executives of large brands and retailers who would say in certain terms that they didn't really care about returns. And I think a lot of that had to do with the interest rate environment and less demand for quality goods at lower price points and frankly, less pressures from consumers. But I think we're in the middle of an interesting place in time in that we've exited a zero interest rate environment for the first time in about 10 years, number one. And then number two, that we're also at the precipice of a very large demographic shift when it comes to consumers and who's buying the majority of products and what they care about. So I think that creates a lot of pressure for sort of better and better tools on the front end. And what we really are bullish on is that has created a huge amount of volume that ends up in warehouses and cannot be processed very effectively. Even if you solve a lot of things on the front end, if you don't have the operational tooling, you've just shifted a bottleneck and you've created waste. So I think it's, as Amina said, it's very, very early days still in e-commerce and returns. And I think we're going to see a ton of innovation all over the next decade or more.
Just to add to that, right, the observation, right, definitely is returns. And the other part, which Kyle, you brought up, is to do with the customer acquisition cost. And how much it has gone up for these e-commerce merchants has been ridiculous. So where let's call it gravy train, the party's over, right? It's about actual meaningful businesses, acquisition of customers becoming hard, which means now you have to look at those opportunities because my past life, I've seen a lot of merchants that were doing really well had this idea, be like, yeah, returns, you just get rid of it, right? Like, it's okay because the margins were so good. Like, I've seen that. And I think that's where the evolution and where the puck is starting to go. And then there is this other pool. As much as we talk about all the software and the goodness in the software that's here, in most cases, you see very traditional warehousing systems inside these environments where the dispositioning logic is basic at best. And I'm talking about the really expensive pieces of software that run those facilities. And that's where you get to see where the merchant, the retailer, has that knack and smartness is going to say, okay, I need my core WMS to do all of this, like complex shipping it out in a highly productive way. But for me to actually drive sustainability, to drive, value, I need a good piece of software that helps me on returns from a warehouse floor experience standpoint, right? So a really good call out. I just wanted to touch on those.
State of the Union perspective from you, Jonathan?
Maybe I'll talk just in time scale and maybe the last decade and the next 5 years as a way to talk about this space. Even at a high level, I remember talking to merchants in 2015 about selling on Amazon, and it was no, never, we're direct to consumer. Like, if you look at the successful, direct to consumer merchants today, they've become your modern omni-channel brands. They're no longer direct to consumer. And so it's a matter of when these things are going to change. And for our merchants from 2020 to 2022, they averaged between 50 and 80% year-on-year growth. Right. Yeah. And in the last 18 months, they've averaged between 5 and 9% year-on-year growth. Wow. And so if you think about being a merchant who was accustomed to 50 to 80% growth, and all of a sudden that's 10% of the growth that you were seeing, like, that is a fundamental existential shift in your business. So when your growth slows, money costs more, and the costs of managing all of that cost more. I remember 2017 trying to explain to merchants why they should have returns management or returns initiation solution. And I look at the maturation of our space in 2024, where there's no debate over whether or not you're going to have a returns initiation solution. It's which one, what do I really need? How much should it cost? In 7 years, that industry has completely transformed. And if you just follow the product from the initiation to the processing and to recovery of the items, I think this is still day one, still early innings. And the only way we're really getting to a one-stop shop is if it's like 10 to 15 years from now, we're all working and partnering together.
Just that one-stop shop thing, I just, it is very true just because the level of complexity, right? Like, so if you have a B2B flow versus a direct-to-consumer flow, like if you have these levels of complexity where you might have refurbish as a requirement, you might have all of these various pieces that come in that create complexity, and it's better if you focus and develop something that is more towards, addressing one given problem for a client, right, or a client segment or an ICP, and then move on to the next thing. And to be honest, we are still in its nascent stage right now as far as this industry is concerned with its complexity, because the forward logistics space has evolved quite a lot, by the way, right? Like it has. And reverse is we are just starting to touch it. And I know there have been softwares that have been around decades, right? But I would venture a guess, even you feel like every time you walk into a room, there is a new requirement that pops up that didn't exist before, right?
Totally. Even to like put a couple like really specific examples, like I think the only time you can get to a one-stop solution, so to speak, is once everything is in like stable and steady state. And all of this environment is just far too dynamic for that. We've gone from less than 2% of our merchants charging for different return outcomes to more than 15% of our merchants charging for return outcomes. We've seen returnless refunds, right? I don't even want to pay for the logistics of that. We've seen that like keep item and returnless refund flow go from like 0% adoption to 15 to 18% adoption. And with that come new fraud vectors where, if I as a consumer learn that I'm going to be allowed to keep an item, I might just place another order with a new email address and keep that item. So as the market, like, it's just so dynamic, we've all got to like deal with changes in our own business. That specialization and that focus is still critical. And I do think 2034, this is all stable. And it's likely that there's a much more platformized solution than what's, reasonable to expect today.
Man, you got optimism, brother.
I love it.
Yeah,
We need
exactly.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Julian, keep the optimism flowing, buddy.
I think the one thing that I would say is the use of data and analytics and using that to help our customers make better decisions about returns. How do we shift the automation of dispositioning upstream? So you're capturing as much of the recovery as possible and reducing as much of the cost as possible. And so Jonathan mentioned, the fraud options that could come with the return list. How do you start to treat that, right? You use data to help you identify those bad actors. You use, analytics to help you predict. How do you be dynamic? How do you be leading in those decisions? And so we use the power of machine learning to really predict the outcomes and then route the decision. So I think one of the mainstays of all of our products as we move forward and the value that we all bring, either together as, partners or individually is leveraging data and analytics to help our customers make better decisions about their returns.
You bring up a really interesting point, right? Like it's this ecosystem of the loops and, the G2s and Optoro and bringing in, Trove and 2 boxes it's kind of connect point, right? Can we make decisions that are better upfront by looking at what is the cost of logistics and opportunity cost to then make a decision to say, should we, to Julian's point, should we bring this back? Does it really matter? Is it actually should I just donate it, right? Like, why am I creating? And I would say that's a level of circularity as well, right? Like, it might be better to do that good than to store it inside a warehouse where if you have predictability that says it's not going to sell for the next 9 months or, the probability of sell over the next year is 50%. And if you calculate the storage cost and the transportation cost and the labor that's actually going to go into it in a low margin product, is it really worth it? And yeah, you might have subsets of products where you might end up making good decisions. Again, just proving the point, like we are truly in nascent stage of how much needs to be done in this space.
Yeah,
Sorry,
well,
go ahead.
I wanted to maybe chime in on that point too. I don't think we're at a point where merchants are saying I should build this myself, but when I think of the space that we're in and the nascent nature of it, everyone on this call is reinvesting 40 cents of every dollar they make back into innovation in the product and pushing things forward like this, which is, some of us may be investing 50, 60 cents on the dollar. And I think that investment in innovation is critical in this space. To Julian's point, we're starting to discover things that an individual merchant would never discover. If a return is initiated within 3 days of the shopper receiving the item, it's like 5 to 6 times more likely to be resellable in its existing condition than an item where the return is initiated on like day 10. And so when we start to think about like intelligent routing, like the first 3 days, those should all just go straight back to the warehouse. Days 4 to 15 maybe should go to refurbishment facility. After day 15, maybe they go straight to Trove. We can do things like that. That's innovation that all of us on this call can bring to merchants in this remarkably dynamic, challenging, cost-driven space where there's just like so much unit level profitability we can drive for merchants. To me, it's like the last frontier of real immediate bottom line profit dollars available to merchants. And that's why I think the space is getting focused and where a lot of the data Julian mentioned comes into play.
But I think what's really interesting about what Jonathan's talking about is like unit level economics. And I mean, that is really different to what merchants are used to working with. For us, our entire system is based on millions and millions of data points on millions of items. And I think that is very overwhelming, and the level of detail and data and technology that you need to be able to do that, and then live in a warehouse situation. I think the issue from a re-commerce perspective is that, if you've already invested the labor, you're done. You've already wasted that money. And so you really need to know as soon as possible what is the resale value of that item. And in a perfect world, we'd know before it even left the customer's house. But the reality is that a lot of the time it's when it hits the warehouse when you really start to actually experience it. I mean, and so to the point earlier around how fast the space is changing and the emphasis that brands and retailers, merchants are putting on the space, actually to the point of even investing and putting this software in a facility that's owned and operated by them, is really, I think, the beginning of the shift that we're starting to see around the importance of this as a cost reduction and a revenue generation tool.
Yeah, if I may, I think the point of needing a platform to do this and having the data visibility across every touch point is what you need to get to the kind of optimization where you say, categorically, you need smart disposition with the kind of sophistication across thousands of channels based on predictive data and results in terms of the cost and the revenue of a given channel. But you also need to bring that intelligence upstream into smart routing. And the only way to do that is to have a platform which has a sort of composable and modular architecture, because there's going to be people, I mean, we have customers who come in and say, I want it all. I want soup to nuts. Give me the front end. Give me the initiation. Give me the actual transport with the consolidation, box free, label free, and give me, the processing and dispositioning. And we have other folks who say, I want to enter this journey in one part over here in the supply chain, and then over time, sort of the land and expand, add the front end. And I think the onus is on us collectively to say, great, talk to me about what does your tech stack look like? And how do I need to integrate with you? So I think that fundamentally means we need to, for us, we are API driven, we're composable, we're modular in terms of how you plug into homegrown systems, other systems, people on this call, people not on this call. Think about your TMS, your WMS, every other flavor of the systems that you have in order to truly optimize this such that you can take a look at that data and make decisions about who's a trusted shopper? How do you personalize the returns journeys? How do you have unit and SKU level visibility, across the transom to then determine how you optimize the results from a cost and revenue perspective? So in my mind, without a doubt, you have to have that platform and you have to be able to plug in flexibly all of these components of existing investments you've made, other companies that you have invested in to figure out, how you tackle this really efficiently.
And that is one area of opportunity at an enterprise level, right? Or I should say the 3PL environment requires the front-end experience from an operational execution, right? Like that makes sense. But in warehouse environments, and I can tell you, I've been through warehouses where there is a side where it's Optoro, and on the side there is Manhattan. That's running in parallel. And that headless nature of what we have available, that should be accessible to everyone, because that is an environment. And there is another industry of multi-carrier shipping, right? Like that's the outbound side. And I draw a parallel to that. In that industry, there is 20 different kinds of software. Everyone has their own little nuance of why one should go with one versus the other. But it is, hey, get me the best shipping label for this order that's in front of me. It's as simple as that equation. But you don't have to go outside the WMS and actually do that. And I can get the right label without having to leave my packing screen. So why is returns? And I understand there is configurations, complexities, business rules, etc. that go inside the warehouse that requires a software with containerization. But at a retail level, it should be the core software, WMS, because what's happening right now is it creates more complexity in that handoff, going from the inspection system that then has to act like a logistics system, and then that has to pass it on. That's where some opportunity lies in the large retail space. At least my observation, humble opinion on that front.
I think you're totally on the money there. The other thing is that if you think about categories like apparel, where, 85, 90% are going back to stock. So you think about, how much forward fulfillment is happening out of the reverse side. I think that's the other frontier, Ninad, is to think about, should there be these walls between forward logistics and reverse logistics?
Not at all.
If you look at the data and 90% of the stuff is going back, in the case of apparel, kind of doesn't make sense. You want to look at it in a unified way. And whether that's thinking about your RMS and your WMS and figuring out what's the interplay of the two, how do they work together, how are you actually managing inventory? We have one customer, because they have all the visibility to the data and they've optimized. the full returns life cycle, they're actually ordering 10% less inventory from a forward site. So you talk about the cost of capital, the pressure for profitability, how much working capital is caught up in inventory that if you don't manage this right, it's going to sit there and age, and then it'll be discounted and then, trashed in a landfill. It's like the worst of all possible worlds, no matter how you look at it. So I think there's opportunity to really kind of reframe this in a different way.
We're seeing this trend, right? We're seeing more of the 3PLs come to our space. They have a WMS, but it's been, customized or bastardized to try to do returns, and it's not purpose-built. And so by us bringing a purpose-built solution, integrate, to Amina's point, you can flow materials back into the fulfillment side much faster. But then these SMBs that I see who are looking for an all-in-one, someone can do fulfillment and returns, they hardly ever get a chance to go to a 3PL with the all-in-one tech stack. And so what we're presenting is an all-in-one tech stack now with the 3PL. The customer doesn't have to be the worry. It's one contract, one vendor to manage, both operationally and technology-wise. And I think as we get closer in partnerships with each other, we have to find, the right economics model for us, because 3PLs get 60 or 70 small customers that they aggregate together, and that's how they run their business on the fulfillment side. And all these 60, 70 customers have different returns, and that WMS just can't handle it. Today, you can actually have that multi-tenant, multi-facility solution that a 3PL can sell, one contract to their customer, and you optimize your processing. So I think the trend is there to go to a more all-in-one approach for 3PLs. I think that's going to be their selling space moving forward, and however we can help them is really good.
Appreciate that, Julian. There's been a lot of optimism so far, and I love the conversation. So I actually don't want to go where I'm going to go. And that's the fact that there are, unfortunately, some bad actors in the space. And we're seeing fraud and abuse and issues with authenticity. So I'd love if you all could share a quick story from what you've seen in the space, because Jonathan, I'm sure that's happening on the front end. And certainly Julian and Kyle and Amina, you're seeing that on the back end within the four walls. So maybe, Jonathan, we could kick that off with you.
I think the latest NRF published report talked about returns fraud and returns abuse is like $100 billion problem in the U.S. And when you think about that, that's 3 times the size of the problem that it was a few years ago. And I think what ends up being true is anytime you continue to make something easier and you automate it, you're creating new fraud vectors. There are books on Amazon teaching you how to defraud retailers and send back empty boxes and get your money back, or send back counterfeit items. 3PLs, for example, these third-party logistics providers, and they're humans in facilities processing returns for 20 different brands. If anyone here believes that you're going to be able to teach a human in that role to perfectly identify the authenticity of an item and to process it effectively and quickly and look out for all that sort of stuff, I think we're fooling ourselves at some level. So, we've got humans processing these. Then there's, the category of abuse that what merchant A considers abusing their policy, merchant B may not consider to be abusive of their policy. And if you wait until it gets back to the warehouse to close that proverbial loop is really hard to do, where we've got to bring that intelligence to the merchant beforehand. Now, if you defraud Amazon, they're just going to shut off your account and then you can't buy anything anymore. And that's a pretty good consequence. If you defraud a modern direct-to-consumer brand, one, they're probably never going to catch you based on their own data. And two, if they do, you can just move down the street and defraud, or type in another URL and defraud another retailer. So that's where the data we have at scale, pattern matching, machine learning, the indicators are a lot of the same biometrics that you see with credit card fraud. It's email address, it's when your IP address doesn't match the shipping location, it's all that sort of stuff. And then the policy abuse. I just got off a call with, $100 million merchant the other day, and they were like, we spend hours every week looking for policy abusers, and we just found these, customers who we thought had a customer lifetime value over $2,000, and they've returned 95% of what they've ever bought. Those are things that I think we can, as we continue to automate, as we continue to make things easier, the fraud vectors are going to continue to be exposed, and that's where some of the platform level information and intelligence we can bring to the table can arm merchants to proactively stop that.
And Jonathan, you said this $2,000 LTV merchant returns 95% of the things. That's not fraud or abuse, or is it? Because generationally, bracketing is starting to become, the nature of the beast, right? Maybe it is a certain generation is getting very used to just buying a whole bunch of stuff but returning a whole bunch. How do you do policy management when you got to compete with the Shein and Temus of the world, right? They're on
Yeah,
steroids.
I think it's really critical when you look at a snowflake and then you take a look at the crystal structure of the snowflake and you see there's so many variants of it. On the most innocuous side, there's the people who it just takes them very long, and that may drive some policy changes, because ultimately this is understanding what's the cost and what's the benefit. So if the issue is it's taking you a long time to get the product back, then you need to address the issue of how do you make it easier or more convenient to get it back. And then you've got the people, with the bracketing and the wardrobing. We did a survey, and 40% of shoppers age 18 to 29 were most likely to wardrobe item. That number is so high. So like bracketing, I think we all are familiar with bracketing. About a third of customers said they would bracket, but wardrobing is a real issue. And then if you add the varying SOPs in terms of define what a wardrobe item is, that's when you really need technology. And then ultimately, in terms of the people who are doing the proverbial box of rocks, right? You want to make sure you align your time to refund with fundamentally the level of trust you have in a shopper based on the returns history. And then here's the value of the platform based on what did I tell you versus what did I receive, and what the people, my operators in my warehouse, per my SOPs, deemed new or not new or damaged. And I think that circle is really the circle of trust, if you will, is what you need to do with the data to really figure out how are you not inadvertently punishing the good people because you are so focused on protecting against the bad people. Because the problem is, like, 2/3 of your customers are going to be making their decision to shop with you based on what your returns policies are. Now, you can't really have a one-size-fits-all solution. You have to be able to use data to kind of do this nuancing and figure out who's trustworthy, because let's face it, it's 7 times more expensive to attract a customer than to keep a customer. So good luck to you if you turned everybody away because you optimized, for protecting against fraud. You got to have data end to end and to connect the dots between these items to drive very specific, policy making and decisioning.
Yeah, really, really appreciate that. Gayle, would love to get your thoughts. I know you work with some large brands and retailers, so would love to get...
That probably have authenticity issues, right?
Well, yeah, when I'm listening to you talk, I just don't think we have the same kind of challenges. Typically, if an item is sent to us from a returns flow, we already know if it's coming from a partner, it's either been authenticated from them. And of course, like as we get further into our journey, those items should be being pulled directly out of the returns flow without ever being touched a second time. I think what's interesting is on the trade-in side. For us, actually, it's a lot smaller scale than you would think. We don't really have, yes, we're authenticating items, and when we catch items that are fake, then we use them for training and things, but it's not the same. I think that the scale at which you're operating and the mainline business is just much bigger, and therefore the opportunities are significantly higher.
That makes a lot of sense, right? Because Jonathan's the first line of defense on this one, right? You got Amina, Julian, Kyle kind of coming in, and the other solutions have to say, okay, whatever filtered through, and also they have their own solutions centered around this. But then there is that physical side to say, now I need to capture. And then layering in, I guess, does anyone have any computer vision thing?
Yeah, we use computer vision. One of the biggest problems that you have in re-commerce is actually you don't have data on the item. The item comes dataless. So we're using computer vision to identify the item, because when an item is matched back to an original product detail page, you're actually able to sell the item for a higher value. And then if we're not able to match it back at the point of touch in the warehouse, we then retrospectively are organizing those items together by using computer vision.
Makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. Kyle, love your perspective, buddy.
I would say there's a significant amount of the enterprise retailers, they have more sophistication here. I think there's a significant amount of what we see in the mid-market where you really are running brands today based off gross revenue. There's not really a lot of brands that are running their businesses based off of net revenue. And I like to break it down into 2 parts, right? Like, how do we determine if somebody's a good customer or not? So we can look at return rates and we can find out that somebody returns 95% of their purchases. They might actually be a good customer, but what's the actual yield from that return? How many of those returns are coming back in first quality condition? If they're not coming back in first quality condition, why are they not? And how much evidence? It's not that difficult to understand if somebody's a fraudulent customer, a wardrober, an abuser. It is pretty simple, especially when you start to see this across many, many data points. The biometrics, as Jonathan said, around who these folks are, I think is really important. And you can see what do return rates look like, not just based on consumers, but also based on different types of products. So you can identify abuse versus a supplier quality defect, for instance. I think another thing that's really important to call out here is that another fraud vector that is very real, unfortunately to say, is inside of the warehouse. There are bad actors inside of the warehouse. Brands are not aware of that. And it doesn't just affect mid-market 3PLs, it affects Amazon. So this is something that is at scale, it is real, and more data and more insight from not just the front end, but also inside of the facilities is super important.
Great. I just want to add, in my past life, I've actually been part of an RCMP investigation, which is the FBI of Canada, around a multi-year return fraud that was going through for a large retailer. I can tell you it was hundreds of millions of dollars worth of stuff just go poof. So it is, the bad actor thing is very real. So just want to call that out.
Yeah. Julian, why don't you put a nice pretty bow on this for us?
The only thing I would say is that everyone talks about free returns, but we all know free returns don't really exist, right? There's no such thing. And so when you start thinking about these people who are abusing, there's a cost leak there with just the free returns labels that the merchant's paying for. When do you actually ask the customer for returns, coverage in the cost, because they're doing significant amounts of returns, and we're not saying they're bad actors per se, but that's a drain on that organization. The cost of money is tough these days. You have to be careful that you're not leaking those costs, because people are still bracketing in wardrobe and they're still taking advantage of free returns, and it's costing the company, millions of dollars on the back end. Inside the warehouse, I think the big thing, authentication, identification of products continues to be a significant thing. The computer vision, we're tapping into that ability to go outside of catalogs and find similar matches of products and bring those back to our employees to receive product in, so it doesn't halt it, because people do return the box of rocks, or they return the computer. They've taken all the CPU, the memory, they've taken all the good stuff out and left the empty, that happens. That's a real thing. Our ability to capture that information is definitely something we all should continue to work on.
Appreciate that, Julian. This time has absolutely flown by. Want to give each of you maybe 30 seconds to share with the audience where to follow you on social media and the best way they can reach you or find out more about your companies. Gayle, we'll start with you.
Gayle Tait, look me up. I accept DMs. I'm slide into my
Love
DMs.
it.
That sounds kind of dodgy, but yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Amna?
You can hit me up on LinkedIn at Amina Ali, or find us at optoro.com. Would love to talk to you about how we could help you as a retailer brand 3PL with our returns management system and platform.
Amazing. Thank you. Jonathan?
So you can find Loop at loopreturns.com. You can find me on LinkedIn or on X. The handle on both LinkedIn and Twitter is Poma JP. So last name, first and middle initial.
Amazing. Thank you. Julian?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn as well. You can find us at g2rl.com, and also you can find our organization on LinkedIn as well. We're here to help everyone from brands, retailers, OEMs, manufacturers, and 3PLs.
Thank you, Julian. And to wrap things up, last but not least, Kyle?
Yeah, you can check us out at twoboxes.com. That's TWO, boxes.com. I'm Kyle Bertine on LinkedIn. And then I'm just Kyle at twoboxes.com. If you'd like to talk to me, please email me.
Excellent. Well, once again,
thank you very
guys
much,
so
guys.
much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ninad Acharya, CEO and co-founder of Fulfillment IQ. And I'm here with
Dan Call, CRO and partner at Fulfillment IQ. We're the team behind the Ecom Logistics podcast. Our mission is to provide you with genuine insights from our work alongside logistics leaders to help you improve your supply chain.
In the Ecom Logistics podcast, we share the knowledge and the insights we've gained from working alongside amazing brands, retailers, 3PLs, and VCs, so you can make the most out of your supply chain journey.
If you like what you're hearing, we'd truly appreciate your support with a 5-star rating on your favorite podcasting channel. Your feedback not only keeps us going, but also helps others find the podcast. If you think Fulfillment IQ can assist you, or if you have an idea related to logistics, just reach out to us on LinkedIn. We're always up for a chat and ready to explore new possibilities together.
Stay tuned to the Ecom Logistics Podcast on your favorite podcast platform for fresh and practical insights into e-commerce and logistics. Until next time, let's keep making a difference.